looking at a young black king.
Astro project, blast of a tech, pass your neck with the shit to leave a rapper and Rex from the back of a black Acura. Bullet ricocheted and it's swayed and it passed through your pecs. The assassin wet. All y'all know y'all don't have to go. Sawed off shoddy, make you potty, probably call the law. Me no gangster, I'm no tough, got me child of the most high. I get on the mic and you go, bye-bye. Devil don't test me, I throw shrapnel where your chest be. Shooting our family down in the streets, fuck the police, they ain't marching for me. Pull up, not that Rari, I ain't bad yet. I pull up, out that 85% of mass at. I put this on God, bad black is so hard. Bitch, I'm going back to Harlem in my West African garb.
As I learned, we all learn podcast coming 2022. So stay tuned, family.
For millions of years, our planet has been floating in space. Millions of creatures have lived on its surface. Many a quaint being was among them, but they affected only our human imagination. For in the evolutionary struggle, we are the only ones who have obtained the advantage of reason. Reaching it was far from easy. Its origin dates back 20 million years to those fruit-eating creatures that lived in African trees called proconsuls. They romped about in trees, far above terrestrial dangers, feeding on fruit and leaves. Depending on the species, they varied in size from the marmoset to the gorilla. They hardly cared about the world below. Proconsuls climbed about the branches on all fours and almost exactly resembled the modern-day macaque. Their upper and lower limbs were the same size. They moved leaning on open palms instead of bended fingers. Quite a few fossils of proconsuls have been found in East Africa. The skull was primitive, the brain small and rather simple, yet the comparatively small size of their muzzle and canine teeth suggests non-aggressiveness, one of the major features that led to reason. But 10 million years ago, a drop in temperature made the African jungle sparse, which rendered it impossible to move from tree to tree via branches. Forced to leave the trees, the descendant of proconsul, Ardipithecus, began moving on their rear limbs. Their feet were still prehensile, but with special arches that allowed bipedalism. The nearly complete skeleton of an Ardipithecus named Ardi proves that these creatures were able to walk, albeit not as easily as we do. The arms of Ardipithecus were knee-length, and the hands were half human and half ape-like. The first steps were taken to climb the next tree. Ardipithecus didn't want to leave tree crowns, their habitual homes. They were indeed the intermediate between humans and apes, as all of Ardi's features mediate entirely ape-like and entirely human features. But life moved on. Trees became sparse, and Africa turned into a boundless savanna. 4 million years ago, new creatures paced in the savanna. Gracile australopiths. They were well adjusted to their new home. Their way of walking on two legs was not so different from ours. They gathered and ate everything, and were able to walk miles on end. They formed cohesive groups, which allowed them to repel any danger. Moreover, they were curious. Their skull was still ape-like, with an obtrusive muzzle and receding forehead. At first glance, it is hard to detect our features, but the head was held on the upright neck, the canine teeth got smaller, and the brain bigger. 3 million years ago, Australopithecus afarensis of East Africa evolved into the first humans. 2.5 million years ago, our ancestors crossed the Rubicon of brain size, 700 grams. The first representative of our genus, Homo habilis, handyman. He got his name for a reason. It was Homo habilis who was the first to make stone tools. These primitive choppers made from pebble with a few blows were still real tools for carving meat, whittling wood, defending from predators, and killing prey. Man was now armed. Life in the trees was left for good, and the savanna promoted forward movement. Perhaps our love for travel and exploration dates back to those times. The world was perilous, but intelligence made it possible to overcome difficulties. It was not power or aggression, but intelligence that protected the first humans. The skull of Homo habilis is very much like that of Australopithecus, yet the brain size was 600 to 800 grams now, 1.5 times as much as its predecessors. The face became smaller. Around 1.5 million years ago, a new species appeared, Homo ergaster, working man. They became the terror of the African savanna. Spears and stone tools were an unprecedented phenomenon. Even the fiercest animals weren't safe from harm now. Man became a hunter. Skeletons of antelopes and even elephants, surrounded by stone tools, have been found in East Africa. Cut marks on animal bones are visible evidence of a new stage of our evolution. Possibly, this is around the same time humans first discovered fire, albeit the evidence of that is rare and unreliable. Quite a few fossils of the first humans have remained in East Africa. The ape-like legacy in the skull was now in the past, but their jaws were still large, and their brains twice as small as ours. Their height and build were exactly like that of modern humans. Their bodies, except for their heads, were hardly any different from ours. They settled all over Africa and were the first to move beyond. The last step was to colonize the planet, so they took that step, and the vast expanses of the planet were conquered by new masters. Not right away, though. The planet didn't give man a hearty welcome. Nature should not be underestimated. At all times, life was no bed of roses. Human remains with marks of predators' teeth bear witness to that. Yet it was hardship that engendered and fostered reason. Homo heidelbergensis were the first prehistoric humans whose brain size was equal to what we have now. Although their faces were still savage, their eyes shone with the renewed light of reason. They built shelters, buried their dead, and created the first objects of art, crude as they were. Man has gone through a long and difficult path of evolution. What does the future have in store? Reason makes us responsible for ourselves. Now, everything depends on us.
So peace to everybody out there, man. I hope all is well in the land of the lost. We're about to get into chapter 20 of Sussman's work regarding the myth man, the hunter, man, the killer, and the evolution of human morality. I'm zooming in on the screen so you actually can see this very clearly on your cell phones. Please, again, like the show, share the show, tell a friend and tell a friend. We're about to take a walk down memory lane. The earliest hominids as hunters. With the development of the theory of evolution, Darwin put humans in their place with the rest of the animal kingdom. Subject to the same laws of nature, however, in so doing, even Darwin visualized a spiritual and intellectual gap between humans and their closest ancestors and relatives. As he stated, there can be no doubt that the difference between the mind of the lowest man and that of the highest animal is immense. Late 19th century theorists took this gap to heart and looked for early human fossils that fit this expectation. Sir Arthur Keith went so far as to set up a brain volume threshold of 750 cc between man and the apes. It is no wonder that the Piltdown man with this ape-like jaw and large cranium was immediately accepted as the earliest hominid ancestor, while the small-skulled ape like Australopithecine, discovered in 1924 by Raymond Dart, was considered a pathological specimen of a mere ape. While Piltdown supporters were busy explaining the intellectual endowments of a large brain ancestors, Dart was convinced his small-brained creature was the first ape man, and he developed a theoretical picture of the behavior of this transitional form. See, at first, Dart believed that Australopithecine were scavengers barely eking out of existence in the harsh savanna environment, a primate that did not like to kill large animals but scavenge small animals in order to live. So, fear carried with Dart belief, however, because of this ape, took his ape man seriously. In fact, it was not until the quarter of the century later, when the unearthing of many Australopithecines and the discovery in 1953 that the Piltdown was a fraud. The students of human evolution realized our earliest ancestors indeed were more ape-like than they were like modern humans. This led to a great interest in using primates to understand human evolution and the evolutionary basis of human nature. With these discoveries became a long list of theories attempting to recreate the behavior and often the basic morality of the earliest hominids. By 1950, Dart developed a different view. Given the game animals with which they were associated and some dents and holes in the skulls of the Australopithecines, Dart became convinced that the mammals had been killed, butchered, and eaten by the ape men, and that these early hominids had even been killing one another. He stated, the ancestors of Australopithecus left their fellows in the trees of Central Africa through a spirit of adventure and the more attractive fleshy food that lay in the vast savannas of the southern plains. Rather than leaving the trees to search out a meager existence in the savannah, Dart now saw that hunting and a carnivorous lust for blood drew the man apes out of the forest and was a main force in human evolution. Dart's view of human evolution was not devoid of moral judgment. In fact, With their innovative substance pattern, Dart believed that the earliest hominids also created a new moral code. The hunting hypothesis, as it is referred to by Cartmill, was linked from the beginning with a bleak, pessimistic view of human beings and their ancestors as instinctively bloodthirsty and aggressive. Dart claimed that Autopolyticus or Autopolyticines were, right, a part of their confirmed killers, carnivorous creatures that seized living quarries by violence, battered them to death, tore apart their broken bodies, and dismembered them limb from limb, greedily devouring the living within the flesh. The lonesome cruelty of mankind to man is explicable only in terms of man's carnivorous and cannibalistic origin. This marks of the Cain separates man dietetically from the anthropidal relatives and allies, him with the deadliest of carnivores. So Dart's vision of early man morality, however, is not new in Western myth, religion, and philosophy. Cartmill, in his recent book, A View to a Death in the Morning, shows that in the remnants of the early Greek and Christian views of human morality, Dart himself began his 1953 paper with a quote from the 17th century Calvinist divine Richard Baxter: "Of all these beasts, the man beast is the worst. To others and himself, the cruelest foe." In 1773, James Burnet introduced the man, the hunter, theme arguing that when necessity forced man to hunt, the wild beast part of him became predominant. War succeeded hunting, and he became fiercer than any other animal when not subdued by laws and manners. As Cartmill states, the early Christian philosophers believed that we human beings are free to choose what is unnatural for us. It follows from this that only human beings have the capacity to be corrupted. Most ancient philosophers assume that whatever is natural is good. Since animals always do what is natural for them, but people do not, animals are better than people in this regard. The idea that other animals are by their nature better than saner than man is essentially a modern idea. It commingles classically animalitarianism with their distinctively Christian belief, the doctrine that in human beings, nature herself has gone rotten. The view of the depravity of human nature is related to the idea of man's fall from grace, of the Christian notion of original sin. As we shall see, these medieval myths still pervade many modern scientific interpretations of evolution, of human behavior, and human nature and morality. Dart's evidence for man, the hunter, was not good, and his particular vision of the human hunter-killer hypothesis did not have much staying power. Upon examining of the evidence, C.K. Brain noted that the bones associated with the man's ape were exactly like fragments left by leopards and hyenas. The round holes in the dents in the fossil skulls match perfectly with fangs and leopards and with impressions of rocks pressing against the buried fossils. It seems that the Anthropocene were likely the hunted and not the hunters. Man the hunter or man the dancer. The next widely accepted version of this reoccurring man the hunter theme was presented in the late 1960s by Sherwood Washburn and his colleagues. They claimed that many of the features of that defined men as hunters again separated the earliest humans from their primate relatives. To assert the biological unity of mankind is to affirm the importance of the hunting way of life. It is to claim that, however much conditions and customs may have varied locally, the main selection pressures that forged the species were the same. Their biology, psychology, and customs that separated us from apes, all these were owed to the hunters of time past. And for those who would understand the origin of nature of human behavior, there's no choice but to try to understand man, the hunter. Like Dart, Washburn related human hunting to human morality, both of which had their biological basis in our evolutionary past. Man takes pleasure in hunting other animals, unless carefully training has hidden the natural drives. Men enjoy the chase and the kill. In most cultures, torture and suffering are made public spectacles. For the enjoyment of all, carnivorous curiosity and aggressions have been added to the inquisitive and dominant striving of the ape. The carnivorous psychology may have had its beginnings in the depredations of the Australopithecines. Again, much like Dart before him, Washburn did not amass a large amount of evidence to support his theory. Rather, he relied upon a 19th century anthropological concept of cultural survival, behaviors that are no longer useful in society, but that persist and pervasive are survivals from a time when they were adaptive. Men enjoy hunting and killing, and these activities are continued in sports even when they are no longer economically necessary. If a behavior is important to the survival of a species, as hunting was for man throughout most of human history, then it must be both easily learned and pleasurable. Using a similar logic, I have developed an alternative but no less feasible theory: man, the dancer. After all, men and women love to dance. It is a behavior found in all cultures and has less obvious functions in most cultures than does hunting. Although it takes two to tango, a variety of forms of social systems could develop from various forms of dance: square dancing, line dancing, river dance, or the funky chicken. The footsteps at Leotoli might not represent two individuals going out for a hunt, but the Afronesis shuffle, one of the earliest dances. In the movie in 2001, it was wrong to depict the first tool as a weapon. It could easily have been a drumstick, and the first battle may not have involved killing at all, but a battle of the bands. Other things, such as a face to face sex cooperation language and singing and bipedalism, is difficult to dance on all fours. Even moving out of the trees and onto the ground might not all be better explained by our propensity to dance than by our desire to hunt. Although I am being facetious, using the cultural survival approach, the evidence for dancing is certainly as good as that for hunting. Between 1961 and 1976, the playwright Robert Aldrich popularized the then current version of the man, the hunter, man, the killer myth with a number of popular books. He believed that it was the competitive spirit as acted out in warfare that made humans what they are today. The mentality of the single Germanic tribe under Hitler differed in no way from that of early man or late baboon. Because of a lack of competitive territorial instinct, Audrey believed gorillas had lost the will to live and with it the drive for sex. He argued that gorillas defend no territory or copulate rarely, and their story will end one day not with a bang but with a whimper. To Audrey, it was war and the instinct for territory that led to the great accomplishment of Western man. How can we get along without war? It is the only question pertaining to the future that bears the faintest reality in our times. For if we fail to get along without war, then our future will be remarkably lacking in human problems as it will be remarkably lacking in men. Do you care about freedom? Dreams may have inspired it and wishes promoted it, but only war and weapons have made it yours. Although more spectacular than the claims of contemporary scientists, Audrey's views of human nature did not differ greatly from them, nor from the ancient Christian beliefs of man fall from grace and original sin. To Audrey, however, sin is good. We are Cain's children. The union of enlarging brain and the carnivorous way produced man as in genetic possibility. Man is a predator whose natural instinct is to kill with a weapon. If man is unique in his soul, some special creations, and his future is to be determined by an innate goodness, nobility, and wisdom, then he is finished. But if man is not unique and a proud creature, bearing in his genes the scars of ages, then man has a future beyond the stormiest contradictions. The hunter myth and social biology. This might be considered the beginning of what has been called evolutionary ethics, which was developed with the next major scientific statement on the importance of hunting in the formulation of human nature. See, this theory was introduced in the mid-1970s by E.O. Wilson and the proponents of social biology. Wilson describes a number of behavioral traits that he claims are found in humans generally and are genetically based in human universals. These include territorially aggressive dominance hierarchies, permanent male-female bonds, male dominance over females, extended maternal care, and matrilineality. The argument Wilson uses to support his idea that these traits are biologically fixed, genetically based characteristics is their relative constancy among our primate relatives and their persistence throughout human evolution and in human societies generally. Elsewhere, I have provided evidence that these behavioral characteristics are neither general primate traits nor human universal. Again, these traits were believed to be product of our hunting past. For at least 1,000,000 years, probably more, man engaged in hunting gathering way of life, giving up the practice a mere 10,000 years ago. We can be sure that our innate social responses have been fashioned largely through this lifestyle. Social Darwinism proclaimed that human morality should be based on evolutionary process of the survival of the fittest. Individual ethnic groups, races, or societies that were most fit would survive, and those that were weak would be eliminated, and this was good. Competition, especially winning in competition, was the basis of human ethics and morality. Human Spencer, the father of social Darwinism, argued that we should cherish the evolutionary process so that the fittest would be able to survive and the inadequate would be rigorously eliminated. This, of course, is remnants of Ardrey's proclamations. Social biologists do not find fault with the fact that social Darwinism linked evolution to the ethics, but simply that when this theory was popular, the mechanisms of evolution was poorly understood. As stated by Roos and Wilson, recent advances in evolutionary history have cast a new light on the matter, giving substance to the dreams of the old theorists. Given social biological tenets, the claim was that we now can proceed from known facts rather than mere theory to ethics. These facts are basically: one, the goal of the living organism is to pass on one's own genes at the expense of all others. Two, an organism should only cooperate with others if A, they carry some of his or her own genes, kin selection, or B, if at some later date the others might aid you, reciprocal altruism. However, since animals cannot make these calculations, evolution has endowed our genes with a moral ethic to reciprocate, because ultimately this may help us perpetrate and multiply our own genes. As explained by Roos and Wilson, it is used to be the thought in the bad old days of social Darwinism, when evolution was poorly understood, that life is uninterrupted struggle, nature red in tooth and claw. But this is only one side of natural selection. The same process also leads to altruism and reciprocity. Morality is merely an adaptation, but put in place and further our reproductive ends. Ethical codes work because they drive us to go against our selfish day-to-day impulses in favor of long-term group survival, and thus, over our lifetimes, the multiplication of our genes many times. Following this logic, evolutionary morality ultimately has allowed us to build group cohesion in order to successfully compete with strangers and thus pass on our genes. We should not look down upon our warlike, cruel nature, but rather understand that it has led to success. In an evolutionary sense, when coupled with making nice with some, but not with other individuals or groups of individuals. The making nice part is genetically driven and the basis of human morality. As Wilson states, throughout recorded history, the conduct of war has been common. Some of the noblest traits of mankind, including team play, altruism, patriotism, bravery on the field of battle, and so forth, are the genetic product of warfare. If the planned society were to deliberate steer its members past those stresses and conflicts that once gave the destructive phenotypes their Darwin edge, the other phenotypes might dwindle with them. In this, the ultimate genetic sense, social control would rob man of his humanity. Or, as more recently stated by Roos, where kin selection fails, reciprocal altruism provides a backup. But as one grows more distant in one's social relationship, one would expect the feeling to decline. It is silly to pretend that our dealings across countries are going to be intimate or driven by much beyond self-interest. Jesus did not suggest that the Samaritan was in the general business of charity to strangers. This sounds very much like claims of Darwin archery and the social Darwinists before them. Furthermore, the scientific evidence for human universal traits or for the social biological tenets is just as weak as was the evidence provided by archery and Dart to support their theories of human morality. And how do these theories relate to the Western European Christian system and views of morality? Roos explains. If you complain to me that this all starts to sound like warmed over Christianity, I shall agree again. Love your neighbor as yourself. Sounds like a pretty good guide to life to me. And I gather it also does to many other people in non-Christian cultures. A majority of reasons why Christianity was such a raging success. But we must always ask, are the Christian morals professed generated by the scientific evidence for biologically based morality, or do we think they are biological universals because they happen to fit our own Christian ethics? Roos states, I am not much of a relativist. I condemn as strongly as anyone the rapes in the Yugoslavia and the atrocities of Hitler. But morality is usually in the eyes of the beholder, and I am sure that Roos' code of ethics is not the same as that of the Yugoslavs and of Hitler's troops, mainly Christians, who committed these offenses. Chimpanzees and human males as demonic killers. The newest claim of importance of killing and the biological basis of morality is that of Richard Ragham and Dale Peterson in their new book, Demonic Males. They argued that 20 to 25 years ago, we thought human aggression was unique. Researchers on the great apes had revealed that they were basically unaggressive, gentle creatures, and also that their separation of humans from our ape ancestors occurred 15 to 20 millennia. Although early theorists proposed that hunting, killing, and extreme aggressive behavior were biological traits inherited from our earliest hunting, hominid and ancestors, many anthropologists still believe that patterns of aggression were environmentally and culturally determined learned behaviors. Our sins were thought by most to be acquired and not inherited characteristics. They were not original, our sins, that is. Ragham and Peterson argue that new evidence indicates that killer instincts are not unique to humans. We share these characteristics with our nearest relative, the common chimpanzee. In fact, it is inherited propensity for killing that allows hominids and chimps to be such a good hunters. Ragham's and Peterson's theory is as follows. The split between humans and common chimpanzees is much more recent than was once believed. Only 6 to 8 millennia. Well, MYA, y'all know what that means. Furthermore, Humans may have split from chimpanzee bonobo line after gorillas, with bonobos or pygmy chimpanzees separating from chimps only 2.5 million years ago. Because chimpanzees may be the common ancestor of all these forms, and because the earliest Arthropithecines was quite chimpanzee-like, Ragam in the previous article speculates that the most reasonable view for the moment is that chimpanzees are conservative species and amazingly good model for the ancestors of hominids. And if we know what our ancestors look like naturally, we get clues about how it behaved. That is, like modern day chimpanzees. Finally, if modern chimpanzees and modern humans share similar or certain behavior traits, these traits have long evolutionary roots and are likely to be fixed, biologically inherited components of our nature and not culturally determined. Rackham goes on by illustrating a number of traits shared by early hominids and chimpanzees and states that this is a strange paradox, a species trembling on the verge of hominization, but so conservative that it was stayed on the edge. Chimpanzees even have different cultural traditions in different populations. However, it is not these traits that are the most important, rather, it presumes shared patterns of aggression. Ragam and Peterson claim that only two animal species, chimpanzees and humans, live in patrilineal male-bonded communities with intense male-initiated territorial aggression, including lethal raiding into neighboring communities and such vulnerable enemies to attack and kill. Ragam asked, does this mean chimpanzees are naturally violent? 10 years ago, it wasn't clear. In this culture species, it may turn out that one of the least variable of all chimpanzee behaviors is the intense competition between males, the violent aggression they use against strangers, and their willingness to maim and kill those that frustrate their goals. As the picture of chimpanzee society settles into focus, it now includes infecticide, rape, and regular battering of females by males. Since human and chimpanzees share these violent urges, Ragam believes that we also share an inborn morality. The implication is that strong aspects of human violence have long evolutionary roots. What are we? In our aggressive urges, we are not Gauguin's creature of culture. We are apes of nature, cursed over 6 million years or more with a rare inheritance, a doxycophene demon. The coincidence of demonic aggression in ourselves and our closest kin bespeaks its antiquity. Like Dart, Washburn, and Wilson, before them, Ragam and Peters theorized that killing and violence are inherited from our ancient relatives. However, they argue this is not a trait unique to hominids, nor is it byproduct of hunting. In fact, it is just this violent nature and natural bloodlust that makes both humans and chimpanzees such good hunters. Bonobos help Ragam and Peterson come to this conclusion. Since they claim bonobos have lost their desire to kill, they also have lost their desire to hunt. The bonobos tell us the suppression of personal violence carried with the suppression of predatory aggression. The strongest hypothesis at the moment is that bonobos came from a chimpanzee-like ancestor that hunted monkeys and hunted one another. As they evolved into bonobos, males lost their demonism, becoming less aggressive to each other. In so doing, they lost their lust for hunting. Murder and hunting may be more closely tied together than we are used to thinking. Ragam believes that bloodlust ties killing and hunting tightly together. But in this scenario, it is the desire to kill that drives the ability to hunt. Like other social biologists, Ragam and Peterson believe this lust to kill is based upon the selfish gene, they argue. The new theory elegantly popularized in Dawkins, the selfish gene, is now the conventional wisdom in biological science because it explains animal behavior so well. The general principle that behavior evolves to serve selfish ends has been widely accepted, and the idea that humans might have been favored by natural selection to hate and to kill their enemies has become entirely, if tragically, reasonable. Of course, the selfish gene theory is also used to explain why bonobos don't kill their enemies. This level of generality has about the same explanatory power as that of the late 18th century biologist Jeremy Bentham's moral philosophy, which claimed that human behavior is governed by pleasure and pain. Bentham believed that all human is dictated by seeking to enhance pleasure and to minimize the likelihood of pain. In fact, both of these philosophies attempt to explain everything and therefore explain very little, but that is for another essay. Problems with these theories. As with many of the new social biologist theories, I find them problems with both the theory itself and with evidence used to support it. According to Rockman and Peterson, humans and chimpanzees might share biologically fixed behaviors because they are more closely related to each other than chimpanzees are to gorillas, and chimps are a good model for our earliest ancestors and retain conservative traits shared by both. The first of these statements is still hotly debated because the chimps, gorillas, and humans are so close that it is difficult to tell exact divergence times of patterns between the three. The second statement is just not true. Chimpanzees have been evolving for as long as humans and gorillas, and there is no reason to believe that ancestral chimps were similar to present day chimps. The fossil evidence is extremely sparse, and it is likely that many forms of apes have become extinct. Furthermore, if chimpanzees were a good model for ancestral hominoid and a conservative representative of the phylogenetic group, this would not mean that humans necessarily share specific behavioral traits. As Rockland and Peterson emphasized, chimps, gorillas, and bonobos are all very different from one another in their behavior and in their willingness to kill conspecifics. Because of these differences, in fact, Roggam and Peterson agree that evolutionary and initia alone cannot explain behavior similarities or differences. Thus, the proof of Roggman's and Peterson's theory does not rest on the theoretical grounds, but relies solely on the evidence that violence and killing in chimpanzee and in humans are behaviors that are similar in pattern, have ancient shared evolutionary roots, and are inherited. Roggam and Peterson state the chimpanzees and the humans killed members of neighboring groups of their own species is a startling exception, the normal rule of animals. They go on to point out that this is especially true of adults killing adults. Fighting adults of almost all species normally stops at winning. They don't go on to kill. However, as Rangan points out, there are exceptions such as lions, wolves, spotted hyenas, and I would add a number of other predators. In fact, most species do not have the weapon to kill one another as adults. Agonism between adults in many species is common in various circumstances, but certainly it would take two adult squirrel rabbits or ardocs much more energy than it is worth to kill their opponent than to drive it away. They just don't have the tools. Chimpanzees and humans do, although the tools they use are radically different. So the chimpanzee's aggression, just how common is conspecific killing in chimpanzees? This is where the real controversy may lie. During the first 14 years of study at GOM, chimpanzees are described as peaceful, unaggressive species. In fact, during a year of concentrated study, Goodall observed 284 agonistic encounters. Of these, 66% were due to competition for introduced bananas, and only 34% could be regarded as attacks occurring in normal aggressive contexts. Only 10% of the 284 attacks were classified as violent, and even attacks that appeared punishing to me often resulted in no discernible injury. Other attacks consisted merely of brief pounding or hitting, after which the aggressor often touched or embraced the other immediately. Chimpanzee aggression before 1974 was considered no different from patterns of aggression seen in many primate species. In fact, Goodall explains that in her monograph, The Chimpanzee of Gom, she uses data mainly from the 1975 because the early years presented a very different picture of the Gom chimpanzees as being far more peaceful than humans. Other early naturalist descriptions of chimpanzee behavior were consistent with those of Goodall and confirm her first 14 years of observation. Even different communities were observed to come together with peaceful, ritualized displays of greeting. However, between 1974 and 1977, 5 adult males from one subgroup were attacked and disappeared from the area, presumably dead. Why, after 14 years, did the patterns of aggression change? Was it because the stronger group saw the weakness of the other and decided to improve its genetic fitness? Surely they were stronger and weaker animals and in subgroups before this time. We can look to Goodall's own observation for an answer. In 1965, Goodall began to provide restrictive human-controlled feeding. A few years later, she realized that the constant feeding was having a marked effect on the behavior of chimps. They were beginning to move about in large groups more often than they had ever done in old days. They were sleeping near camp and arriving in noisy hordes early in the mornings. Worst of all, the adult males were becoming increasingly aggressive. When we first offered the chimps bananas, the males seldom fought over their food. Now, not only was there a great deal more fighting than ever before, but many of the chimps were hanging around camp for hours and hours every day. See, by this time, the social behavior and ranging patterns of the animals was already disrupted, and the increasing aggression eventually created so many problems that observation was almost ended at Gom. The possibility that human interference was a main cause of the unusual behavior of the Gom chimps was the subject of an excellent book by Margaret Power. Ragam and Peterson essentially ignored this book, stating that yes, this might have been unnatural behavior if it weren't for new evidence of similar behavior occurring since 1977 and elsewhere in Africa. What is this evidence? Ragman and Peterson provided 4 examples. Here's the first. Between 1979 and 1982, the Gom group extended its range to the south and conflict of southern group Kalande was suspected. One day in 1982, a raiding party of males reached Goodall's camp. Ragman and Peterson state some of these raids may have been lethal. However, Goodall describes the only reported raid as follows. One female was chased by a Kalande male and mildly attacked. Her 14-year-old son encountered a second male but was only sniffed. Although Ragam and Peterson implied that these encounters were similar to those at Gom, in this single observed raid, no violence was ever witnessed. However, Ragam and Peterson's report that in 1981 an adult male, Humphrey, was found dead near the home of a range border. They failed to mention that Humphrey was approximately 35 years old, and wild chimps rarely live past 33 years. From 1970 to 1982, 6 adult males from one community in the Japanese study site of Mahal disappeared one by one over this 12-year period. None of these animals were ever observed being attacked or killed, and one was sighted later roaming as a solitary male. Nishidi stated, While the adult males disappeared and succession remains a puzzle, they go on to speculate that at least some of these males may have been killed by chimpanzees from another group. However, the rationale for the assumption is that at Gome, adult males of the main group exterminated those of the branch group. In another site in West Africa, Ragam and Peterson reported that researchers Bosch and Bosch believe that violent aggression among the chimpanzees is as important as it is in Gome. However, in this paper referred to, the authors simply state that the encounters by neighboring chimpanzee communities are more common in this site than in Gome, and that this may lead to a larger, more cohesive group structure and a higher involvement of the males in social life. There is no mention whatsoever of violence or killing during these encounters. Finally, at the site of the Ragam began studying in 1984, an adult male was found dead in 1991. Ragam and Peterson state in the second week of August, Ruzani was killed. No humans saw the big fight. The day before he went missing, our males had been traveling together near the border, exchanging calls with the males of another community. Evidently afraid to meet them 4 days after he was last seen, our team found his disintegrating body hunched at the bottom of a little slope. However, there is no other mention of violence at this site during the 7 years before or the 6 years following this event. In fact, this is the total amount of evidence of male killing among chimpanzees after 37 years of research by an army of researchers. The data for infanticide of rape among chimpanzees are even less impressive. In fact, the data are so sparse for the behaviors among chimps that Ragam is forced to use examples from another great apes, gorillas, and orangutans. However, just as for adult killings among chimpanzees, both the evidence and interpretations of infanticide and rape are suspect and controversial. This is not to say that obtaining meat may not have been significant in human evolutionary history. There is still some debate concerning the importance of hunting, scavenging, and gathering during various stages of human evolution, as was emphasized mainly by feminist anthropologists and in the alternative women the gatherer scenario of human evolution. This continues to be an important subject of empirical investigation. However, even if hunting does not turn out to be a common subsistence technique among early hominids, this does not necessitate aggressiveness in human interactions. It seems that the neurophysiology of interspecies predations is quite different from the spontaneous violence linked to specific aggressions of humans. This was the subject of initial rebuttal by Kennard Lorenz of early hunter-killer scenarios and more recently by Archer. Thus, I am not saying that chimpanzees or humans are not violent under certain circumstances, as we all know, but simply that the claims of inherited demonism might be greatly exaggerated, just as were early claims of Rusian paradise. Is this a reality or a myth? So far, you could say that I have been a devil's advocate or adversary, depending on your point of view. But you might ask, what if Ragam is correct and we and our chimp cousins are inherently sinners? Are we doomed to be violent forever because of this pattern and genetically coded? Is original sin an inborn fixed action pattern that ultimately destroys us? Or as by Ragam, can we go beyond our past, get out our genes, so to speak? In Christianity, presumably, it is the faith in Christ that will lead us out of our sinful ways. Ragam and Peterson believe that we can look to the bonobo as our potential saviors. The bonobos, although even more closely related to the common chimpanzee than humans, have become a peace-loving, love-making alternative to chimpanzee-human violence. How did this happen? In chimpanzees and humans, females of the species select partners that are violent. As Ragam and Peterson say, while men have evolved to be demonic males, it seems likely that women have evolved to prefer demonic males. As long as demonic males are the most successful reproducers, any female who mates with them is provided with sons who themselves will likely be good reproducers. However, among pygmy chimpanzees, females form alliances, reduce male power, and have chosen to mate with less aggressive males. So, after all, it is not violent males that have caused humans and chimpanzees to be their inborn immoral selves. It is rather poor choices by human and chimpanzee females. In any case, now after 5 million years of evolution, is there a way to rid ourselves of an inborn evils? Ragam believes so. What does it do for us then to know the behavior of our closest relatives? Chimpanzees and bonobos are an extraordinary pair. One I suggest shows us some of the worst aspects of our past and our present. The other shows an escape from it. Denial of our demons won't make them go away. But even if we're driven to accept the evidence of a grisly past, we're not forced into thinking it condemns us to an unchanged future. In other words, we can learn how to behave by watching bonobos. But if we can change our inherited behavior so simply, why haven't we been able to do this before Ragam and Peterson's enlightened us? Surely, there are variations in the amount of violence in different human cultures and individuals. If we have the capacity to change by learning from example, then our behavior is determined by socialization practices and by our cultural histories, and not solely by our nature. This is true whether the examples come from the benevolent bonobos or the conscientious objectors, as stated by Kenneth Bach. Surely, there can be no disrupting the fact that humans are able to be aggressive. And there is little guidance in the observation when we are already aware from historical evidence of warfare and other forms of violence in human experience. To observe merely that there has been natural selection for capacities to carry on a social or cultural activity is of limited significance as long as the variations on which selections works occur in a genetic base that is so general as to serve as a great variety of such activities. Then the range of possible cultural results is not explicable by natural selection. Thus, the theory presented by Ragam and Peterson, although it includes chimpanzees as our murdering cousins, is very similar to man the hunter and killer, theories proposed in the past. Further, it does not differ greatly from the early Euro-Christian beliefs about human ethics and morality. We are forced to ask, are these theories generated by good scientific fact, or are they just good to think because they reflect, reinforce, and reiterate our traditional cultural beliefs? Are the scientific facts being interpreted in such a way as to reinforce our traditional Euro-Christian myths or of morality and ethics? Is the theory generated by the data, or are the data manipulated to fit preconceived notions of human morality and ethics? Since data supporting these theories are extremely weak, and yet the stories continue to repeat themselves, I am forced to believe that man, the hunter, is a myth, and that the myth will continue in Western European views on human nature long into the future. I want to give you the very last part again because we have a group of people who talk about early man and hunter as hunters and gatherers and all these different specifics. So I'm going to read this to you again. Is the theory generated by the data, or are the data manipulated to fit preconceived notions of human morality and ethics? Since data supporting these theories are extremely weak, and yet the stories continue to repeat themselves, I am forced to believe that man, the hunter, is a myth, and that the myth will continue in Western European views on human nature long into the future. I don't think that you are catching what I am throwing. The myth of man, the hunter, is driven by preconceived notions. It is pushed by a traditional Euro-Christian myth of morality and ethics. It is sold to us according to a survival of the fittest mindset. You will have one that would argue that, nah, this was early man. As hunter-gatherers, this is what they did. They fought, they were tribal, they did this, they did that. You would hear all of these things in specific. Right? You would hear them say this. But have we seen it demonstrated? Have we seen early man be demonstrated in a sense to show and prove that these behaviors were common in all men? Because we see a change in behavior in chimpanzees and great apes and bonobos, or what they really call in gorillas. There's a temperament change. And in the study, they saw that human interaction led to a more aggressive behavior in the Gomes study. Or were these people pretty much just getting along? Some would say no. Some will rely on, like I said, other animals. The point of this is to exercise the right and the fact of, if we're going to address certain research questions, everything is on the table. But there's a way to actually do this and get to the earliest hominids as hunters. We look for the evidence. We advance it with evidence. Archaeology. We use anthropology. Right? We get these things in our hands and then we assess them to a degree that we understand that, early man was eating meat, or was it animals that was eating people, or we determine all of these things based on the weaponry. So if you missed it earlier, I'm going to run something back for you. I want to run back this particular video. And I want you to pay attention now that you heard what I read. I want you to pay close attention to the video again. You might hear it differently than you did the very first time.
For millions of years, our planet has been floating in space. Millions of creatures have lived on its surface. Many a quaint being was among them, but they affected only our human imagination. For in the evolutionary struggle, we are the only ones who have obtained the advantage of reason. Reaching it was far from easy. Its origin dates back 20 million years to those fruit-eating creatures that lived in African trees called proconsuls. They romped about in trees, far above terrestrial dangers, feeding on fruit and leaves. Depending on the species, They varied in size from the marmoset to the gorilla. They hardly cared about the world below. Proconsuls climbed about the branches on all fours and almost exactly resembled the modern-day macaque. Their upper and lower limbs were the same size. They moved leaning on open palms instead of bended fingers. Quite a few fossils of proconsuls have been found in East Africa. The skull was primitive, the brain small and rather simple, yet the comparatively small size of their muzzle and canine teeth suggests non-aggressiveness, one of the major features that led to reason. But 10 million years ago, a drop in temperature made the African jungle sparse, which rendered it impossible to move from tree to tree via branches. Forced to leave the trees, the descendant of proconsul, Ardipithecus, began moving on their rear limbs. Their feet were still prehensile, but with special arches that allowed bipedalism. The nearly complete skeleton of an Ardipithecus named Ardi proves that these creatures were able to walk, albeit not as easily as we do. The arms of Ardipithecus were knee-length, and the hands were half human and half ape-like. The first steps were taken to climb the next tree. Ardipithecus didn't want to leave tree crowns, their habitual homes. They were indeed the intermediate between humans and apes, as all of Ardi's features mediate entirely ape-like and entirely human features. But life moved on. Trees became sparse, and Africa turned into a boundless savanna. 4 million years ago, new creatures paced in the savanna. Gracile australopiths. They were well adjusted to their new home. Their way of walking on two legs was not so different from ours. They gathered and ate everything, and were able to walk miles on end. They formed cohesive groups, which allowed them to repel any danger. Moreover, they were curious. Their skull was still ape-like, with an obtrusive muzzle and receding forehead. At first glance, it is hard to detect our features, but the head was held on the upright neck, the canine teeth got smaller, and the brain bigger. 3 million years ago, Australopithecus afarensis of East Africa evolved into the first humans. 2.5 million years ago, our ancestors crossed the Rubicon of brain size, 700 grams. The first representative of our genus, Homo habilis, handyman. He got his name for a reason. It was Homo habilis who was the first to make stone tools. These primitive choppers made from pebble with a few blows were still real tools for carving meat, whittling wood, defending from predators, and killing prey. Man was now armed. Life in the trees was left for good, and the savanna promoted forward movement. Perhaps our love for travel and exploration dates back to those times. The world was perilous, but intelligence made it possible to overcome difficulties. It was not power or aggression, but intelligence that protected the first humans. The skull of Homo habilis is very much like that of Australopithecus, yet the brain size was 600 to 800 grams now, 1.5 times as much as its predecessors. The face became smaller. Around 1.5 million years ago, a new species appeared, Homo ergaster, working man. They became the terror of the African savanna. Spears and stone tools were an unprecedented phenomenon. Even the fiercest animals weren't safe from harm now. Man became a hunter. Skeletons of antelopes and even elephants, surrounded by stone tools, have been found in East Africa. Cut marks on animal bones are visible evidence of a new stage of our evolution. Possibly, this is around the same time humans first discovered fire, albeit the evidence of that is rare and unreliable. Quite a few fossils of the first humans have remained in East Africa. The ape-like legacy in the skull was now in the past, but their jaws were still large and their brains twice as small as ours. Their height and build were exactly like that of modern humans. Their bodies, except for their heads, were hardly any different from ours. They settled all over Africa and were the first to move beyond. The last step was to colonize the planet. So they took that step, and the vast expanses of the planet were conquered by new masters. Not right away, though. The planet didn't give man a hearty welcome. Nature should not be underestimated. At all times, life was no bed of roses. Human remains with marks of predators' teeth bear witness to that. Yet it was hardship that engendered and fostered reason. Homo heidelbergensis were the first prehistoric humans whose brain size was equal to what we have now. Although their faces were still savage, their eyes shone with the renewed light of reason. They built shelters, buried their dead, and created the first objects of art, crude as they were. Man has gone through a long and difficult path of evolution. What does the future have in store? Reason makes us responsible for ourselves. Now, everything depends on us.
See, for centuries, man's imagination has been captured by attempts, usually fanciful, to establish the exact locality of the place of origin of human race, the paradise of an ancient mythology. Scientific research of the last few decades, carried out by archaeologists, paleontologists, and workers in allied disciplines, is making it increasingly likely that the legendary birthplace was somewhere on the African continent, probably south of the Sahara. Today, Africa is the home of many human cultural traditions, ranging from simple hunting societies to elaborate urban civilizations as a result of interaction over many millenniums and the selective use of potentialities of the different environments. Indeed, the single most powerful influences on the lives of men, as of other centuries, is the environment in which they live. Temperature, rainfall, and its distribution throughout the year. In short, climate together with the kind of plant communities, the associated animal life, the availability of surface water sources, or of economically important minerals, not only in the shape of the tenor or man's daily life, but have been significant influences on his biological evolution. Animals and plants are adapted to living in a particular habitat through natural selection and competition. Some of the creatures have succeeded in adapting to several different ecological niches, but by reason of man's culture and technology, only he and some life forms dependent upon him have been able to make adjustments that permit him to live anywhere he wants to in the world. Man's emancipation from environmental controls has been a comparatively gradual process through a one steadily quickened tempo. For 9/10 of or so of human history, however, the rate of biological and cultural progression was extremely slow, almost imperceivable. Only in the past few thousand years has man developed the abilities to make possible today's sophisticated urban civilizations. Nevertheless, man remains an integral part, though by far the most influential part, of the many different ecosystems in which he lives, and he now has it in his power to destroy or to conserve or to improve them. Moreover, from the beginning, man's relationship with his environment was one in which he always had the freedom to choose how he could make best use of the natural resources and which of them he should select. It is the possession of the rational intellect of culture, the ability to manufacture artifacts and the skill to use them, that gives man the opportunity to exploit the resources offered by the different habitats. And this finds expression in patterns of behavior that control the lives of every human community, depending on social, legal, and religious sanctions, all of which affect the way of a population reacts and innovations of pressures of external influences. A culture may be a sympathetic or conservative in its acceptance and modifications of new beliefs, tastes, and technologies. In any community, the cultural tradition is made up of the social structure, the economic pattern, the learned ways of behavior, and the influence of these technologies and material culture, of all which are handed down from one generation to the next. For example, in Africa, these people south of the Sahara may be separated generally into two geographically cultural areas. Those in the south and the east were hunting and wild food gathering and the herding of livestock determined the culture. Those in West Africa and Equatoria, where the economy is based upon cultivating of sedentary populations. These ways of life of the peoples in these main cultures areas are broadly similar, except where historical interaction has brought about some modifications or displacement. The concept of culture, areas of its great value for the study of cultural evolution, except in the latest prehistoric periods, however, little evidence other than the less perishable parts of material culture has survived. But as research becomes more advanced, archaeology, the science that seeks to interpret these material remains, is able to provide a time perspective for some of the culture areas. An understanding of the main geographical regions of the continent is not only essential in explanation of the varied ways of life of the African peoples today, but is even more important for understanding the evolution of man, his culture in prehistoric times, and his preference for the selection of some habitats rather than others. Geographically, Africa can be divided roughly into highland and lowland zones by drawing a line from the mouth of the Congo River into the west to the Ethiopian Sudan border in the east. South of this line, High Africa comprises mainly an interior plateau, most of the interior 3,000 and 5,000 feet above sea level, but with higher ridges and mountains. Excuse me. The bedrock is formed in the Precambrian crystalline metamorphic rocks that also commonly obtrude, and some of them provide important sources of mineral wealth. North of our imaginary line, Low Africa composed largely of plains, basins, and sedimentations in which are found the younger sedentary rocks of Craterus and earlier territory periods, and generally between 5,000 and 2,000 feet above sea level. The eastern part of Africa is split by a huge tuff or fault that runs nearly the whole length of the continent. This is the Great Rift Valley, which starts in Asia and Syria and continues southward down the Red Sea through Ethiopia into Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and finally loses itself beneath the alluvial sediments of the lower Zambezi Valley in Mozambique. In Kenya and Uganda, through the splits to the Eastern Rift and the Western Rift, in a shallow basin on the plateau between the two branches lies Lake Victoria, Africa's greatest lake. The bottom of the Great Rift lies an extremely variable elevation. In the Dankil section of Ethiopian Rift, the bottom drops in places to nearly 400 feet below sea level, but southward the floor rises in a series of steeps until Kenya. In the rifts, the Eastern Rift, the elevation is over 5,000 feet. The volcanic rocks and sediments in the area support short grasses and thorn bushes, which are highly favorable to wild game and the pastoralist way of life. The Great Rift is a tectonically unstable zone where compression and tension of the earth crust have pushed up the land and the bordering through the trough into the heights, ridges, and mountains. The deeper portions of the trough are filled by Great Lakes, some of which, such as Lake Tanganyika and Malawi, are among the deepest and longest in the world. Without getting too much into the geography of Africa, I do want to hit you with a little bit of folklore from the evolution of early man from an African perspective. since Africans, in the words of the great late Dr. John Henry Clark, the greatest storytellers on this earth, I figured we'll let them speak for themselves in seeking man's origins. The two gulas. Should be familiar with this because I dropped this on the Mossy before. But it's only right that I actually get into the two. Nah, I ain't gonna hit you with the two gulas. I'm gonna come a little bit more. I'm gonna come with the emerging man. You never heard this one. No. Man's noble pedigree. Yeah, that's it. This is perfect. And then I might get into the emerging man. The great 19th century English naturalist Charles Darwin shocked the world and revolutionized science by proposing that all life can be traced to a common ancestor. His two most famous works are The Origins of Species, 1859, in which he outlines the theory of natural selection, and The Descent of Man in 1871, from which these passages are taken. Darwin was accused of denigrating man by relating him to apes, and of having and undermine the credibility of science through flimsy speculation. However, as is shown here, the scientist was a profound admirer of all life, especially in human brethren. The most ancient progenitors in the kingdom of the vertebrata, at which we are able to obtain an obscure glance, apparently consisted of a group of marine animals. These animals probably gave rise to a group of fishes, as lowly organized as the lancelet, and from these, the gonoids and other fishes like the lepidorson, most have been developed. From such fish, a small advance would carry us on to the amphibians. We have seen that birds and reptiles were once intimately connected together, and the monotremata, egg-laying mammals such as the platypus, now connect mammals with reptiles in a slight degree. But no one can at present say by what line of descent the three higher and related classes, namely mammals, birds, and reptiles, were derived from the two lower vertebrate classes, namely amphibians and fishes. In the class of mammals, the steeps are not difficult to conceive, which led from the ancient monotremata to the ancient marsupials, and from these to early progenitors of the placental mammals. We may thus ascend to the Lumuridae, and the interval is not very wide from these to the Simidae. The Simidae then branch off into two great stems, the New World and the Old World monkeys, and from the latter at the remote period, man, the wonder and the glory of the universe, proceeded. We are naturally led to inquire where was the birthplace of man at the stage of descent when our progenitors diverged from the Catharine stock. The fact that they belong to this stock clearly shows that they were inhabited the old world, but not Australia, nor any oceanic islands, and as we may infer from the laws of geographical distribution. In each great region of the world, the living mammals are closely related to the extant species of the same region. It is therefore probable that Africa was formerly inhabited by extinct apes, closely allied to gorillas and chimpanzees, and as the two species are now man's nearest allies, it is somewhat more probable that our early progenitors lived on the African continent than elsewhere. But it is useless to speculate on the subject. Thus, we have given to man a pedigree of prejudiced length, but not, it may be said, of noble quality. The world, it has often been remarked, appears as if it had been long been preparing for the advent of man. And this, in one sense, is strictly true, for he owes his birth to a long line of progenitors. If any single link in the chain had never existed, man would not have not been exactly what he is now. Unless we willingly close our eyes, we may, with our present knowledge, approximately recognize our parentage, nor need we feel ashamed of it. The most humble organism is something much higher than an inorganic dust under our feet. And no one with an unbiased mind can study any living creature, however humble, without being struck with enthusiasm at its marvelous structure and properties. In the century that has elapsed since Darwin published his studies of evolution, dramatic progress has been made in anthropology and related disciplines. Although much data is still conjectural or controversial, scholars can now piece together with a fair degree of accuracy the fascinating story of man's African's beginnings. Now, what I'm about to read to you is a following essay recently written by Dr. C. Loring Brace, a curator of physical anthropology at the University of Michigan's Museum. Is a lucid survey of what has been learned to date. It suggests how man originated in Africa, while all his forebears were black, and why some, through adaptation, have what we call white skins. Central to any definition of man and the key to his evolutionary success is a phenomenon not immediately visible. When specimens of creatures are scrutinized, this phenomenon is what the anthropologist calls culture. It includes not only the high points of art, music, and literature, but also all those things that result from the cumulative efforts of other people in previous generations. Tools, the traditions regulating their use, vital information, and the language itself are all included in the concept of culture. Man is not just an animal that possesses culture, but an animal that cannot survive without it. Men cannot exist if each had to discover the control of fire, the manufacture of clothing and shelter, the sources of edible substances, and the guidelines of work, interpersonal relationships, to say nothing of the mechanics, electronics, chemistry, and physics on which human life depends today. See, these elements of culture are a cumulative continuation of simpler counterparts in the past. In the beginning, our ancestors, like other animals, must have been faced with the problem of surviving without the aid of culture. So much of culture is perishable and intangible that there is no way to determine when culture as a cumulative phenomenon began. Non-perishable cultural elements have an antiquity of about 2 million years in Africa. The cultural tradition of which they are a part continues without break, expanding to occupy the tropical and temperate parts of the old world around 800,000 years ago, and ultimately developing into all the cultures in the world today. From this, we postulate an African origin of all mankind. The existence of crude stone tools in Africa 1.5 million to 2 million years ago allows us to suppose the existence of culture at the time. Our guess suggests that the possessor of this culture could not have survived without it. Therefore, he deserves the designation man, however primitive and crude he might have been. We further postulate that the culture existed a long time before the initial appearance of recognizable stone tools. This is speculation, but not idle speculation, because we could not otherwise account for the transformation of ape to man. Although small in quantity, supporting evidence exists in the form of skeletal material, fossilized remains, and including skulls, jaws, teeth, and a few other skeletal pieces have been found in association with the oldest known stone tools, both in Olduvai Gorge in East Africa and the Transversal of South Africa. Since the discovery of these fossils in 1924, argument has continued over their status. Ape man, human ancestor, extinct, sideline, brain size was within the range of that for the large modern anthropoid apes, but those early hominids walked erect on 2 feet, as does modern human. Molar teeth were gorillas size, but the canines did not project beyond the level of their other teeth. Despite continuing arguments over whether the balance of traits was one of the human or simian side, it is apparent that the survival of the earliest hominids depended on a distinctively non-ape-like adaptation. Bipedal locomotions did not enable hominids to escape predators by rapid flight. Neither could those hominids seriously threaten to bite a potential predator. Contrast this with such modern ground-dwelling primates as baboon and gorillas, where the enlarged canine teeth of the males represented formidable defense weapons. We can guess that these early hominids depended for survival on something not visible in their anatomy. And our guess is that they used handheld tools. Possibly they defended themselves with the crude hunks or work stone found at the sites where their skeletal remains have been discovered, but more likely they relied on pointed sticks. To use as rocks as defensive weapons requires a close contact with attacking creature, while the defender probably preferred to the face of the tormentor from the far end of a pointed stick. Not only is the pointed stick a simple and effective weapon, divisible within a minimum of manufacturing effort, but it can also double as a digging tool. Edible roots and bulbs are a substantial part of the diet of baboons that live today in the savanna and typical of the areas inhabited by the earliest hominids. The addition of simple digging stick and the kind of used by the surviving hunting and gathering human groups and probably by the early hominids could easily double the baboon's food supply. The huge warm molars of the early hominids indicate that they relied on gritty, uncooked vegetables for a substance. Unlike any other primates, their canine teeth are functionally indistinguishable from their small incisors. As assuming the remote hominid ancestor had enlarged canine teeth, like all other primates, then the creatures associated with the stone tools in East and South Africa 2 million years ago belonged to a line of which the selective pressures needed to maintain canines had been suspended for a long time. Cultural means of defense must have existed long before the earliest stone tools. Within the last 3 years, jaws and teeth have been found in southwestern Ethiopia that are so like the Olduvai and transversal finds that they must be related. Their antiquity, however, extends back nearly 4 million years, and no stone tool are associated with them. The canine teeth in the fragmentary remains are not enlarged, leaving us to infer that defensive weapons must have been used some 4 million years ago, 2 million years before the earliest stone tools existed. Reliance on handheld weapons for defense and perhaps also for food getting did not automatically convert apes into men, but it altered the forces of selection to the evolution in the human direction was a consequence. For one thing, occupation with tool wielding reduced the locomotor role of hands. Legs and feet, as a result of natural selection, assumed the entire burden of the locomotion. Tools usurped the defensive role of canine teeth and with an accumulation of mutations. These teeth were reduced. The vast majority of mutations inferred with the development of the structures that depended on their control, but usually these deleterious mutations are eliminated by selection. When selection is reduced or suspended, as when tools reduce the defensive role of teeth, the reductive mutations simply accumulate in the ongoing gene pool of the population. The structure controlled by the genes, the canine teeth, for example, eventually fails to achieve the full development once characteristics of the remote ancestral population. The evidence from Olduvai Gorge in East Africa shows that crude stone tools were added to the limited cultural repertoire toward the end of this long early hominid phase, a period I prefer to call the Anthropolithecine stage. These tools belong to the incipient part of the tradition of butchering large animals in the Middle Pleistocene. At the end of the lower Pleistocene, however, they occur mainly with the fossilized remains of immature animals. We can guess that this records the beginning of the adaptive shift that was largely responsible for the development of Homo sapiens, a shift related to the development of hunting as a measure of substance activity. See, in the Middle Pleistocene, somewhat less than 1 million years ago, man emerges as a major predator. This adaptation is unique among the primates, and it is not surprising that many of the physical behavior and physiological characteristics that distinguish man from his closest animal relatives are related to this adaptation. While we cannot make direct behavioral and physiological tests on fossils, we can make inferences based on their anatomy, on their apparent ecological adaptation, and on conditions observable in their modern descendants. Anthropologists generally agree that men in the Middle Pleistocene are properly classified as Homo erectus. The first specimens to be discovered was classified in the genus Pithecanthropus at the end of the 19th century. While we no longer accept this generic designation, Pithecanthropine remains as convenient non-technical term for Middle Pleistocene hominids. Brain size was twice that of the preceding Anthropolithecenes and 2/3 that of the average modern man. With the absence of specialized predatory physique, natural selection probably encouraged the evolution of intelligence. While brain size had increased, the size of the molar had reduced. Although they were still quite large by the modern standards, the reduction that may have been related to the shift from a rough vegetables diet to one with large proportions of meat needing only to be reduced to swallowable pieces, requires far less mastications than starches, which began the process of conversion to simply sugars by mixing with salivary enzymes through extensive chewing. Evidence, although fragmentary, also suggests that bipedal locomotion in its modern form was perfect at this time with Middle Pleistocene. While man's model of locomotion may not be speedy, it requires the expenditure of relatively little energy. To this day, primitive hunters employ the technique of trotting persistently on the trail of an herbivore until it is brought to bay, often many days later. Several correlates at this hunting life are suggested. Man, reflecting his primate heritage, is relatively night blind and must therefore confine his hunting activities into the daytime. A tropical mammal, a physiological man, is still a tropical mammal. Pursuing strenuous activities in broad daylight is faced with the problem of dissipating metabolically generating heat. The hairless human skin, richly endowed with sweat glands, is unique among terrestrial mammals of much less than the elephantine size, and I suggest that this development under the selective pressures of regular big game hunting early in the Pithecanthropine stage. The elimination of the hairy coat by natural selection left the skin exposed to the potentially damaging effect of the ultraviolet component of the tropical sunlight. The obvious response was the development of the protective pigment melanin. Consequently, the Middle Pleistocene ancestors of all modern men were probably what an American today is called black. The conversion of this being into what is technically known as Homo sapien requires only further expansion of the brain from the Pithecanthropine average of 1 cubic centimeter, actually well within the range of modern variation, to the average today of 1,400 cubic centimeters. Fragmentary fossil evidence suggests that the transition had been taking place by the beginning of Upper Pleistocene about 120,000 years ago. Men at that time referred to the Neanderthals still had an archaic appearance. In general, these early representatives of Homo sapiens were most muscular and robust than their modern descendants, particularly the males. Jaws and teeth were large, especially the front teeth, which from their wear patterns evidently served as all-purpose tools. Since the first appearance of Homo sapiens in his Neanderthal form, human evolution has been characterized by a series of reductions. Whenever human ingenuity made life easier, there was a relaxation of the forces of selection, and these reductions followed. More effective hunting techniques lessened the burden on the hunter's physique, and eventually reduction in masculinity was the result. Manipulating tools lessened the stress on the anterior teeth, and the consequent reduction of these in their supporting body architecture converted the Neanderthal face into modern form. In parts of the world where manipulative technology is a late phenomenon, such as Aboriginal Australia, faces and teeth have remained large. Where clothing was developed for survival in northern climes, the significance of protective skin pigment was lessened, and the consequent reductions produced the phenomenon that is euphemistically called white. The only thing that has not been reduced is the number of human beings. We cannot even guess at the population density of the Anthropocene throughout the Middle Pleistocene. The archaeological record suggests a fairly constant population for the hunting pithecanthropines. Evidently, the population increased dramatically with the Neanderthal form of the Homo sapiens. The diversification of food resources and the increase in cultural complexity that accompanied the first appearance of modern Homo sapiens just under 35,000 years ago also signaled another sharp jump in population. This set the stage for the tremendous population growth made possible by the development of agriculture after the end of the Pleistocene 10,000 years ago. Thus did Homo sapiens emerge as manifestations of ecological imbalance, literally shaped by the consequences of his own impact upon the world. His fate, too, will be shaped by his future impact on the world. The results of these numbers of his actions. Malthus sounded the alarm nearly 2 centuries ago, but few listened to his warning. One who did was Ambrose Bierce, who aided to his definition of man that his chief occupation is extermination of other animals and his own species, which, however, multiplies with such insistent rapidity as to infest the whole habitable earth. For those of you paying attention to what I was actually just reading just now, that comes from the history of Africa, the horizon history of Africa. For those of you that are interested, now it's a pretty big book. It's an old book. It might be hard for many of you to find, but I now want to wrap up with Basil Davison in his Old Myths, New Truths, African History. Well, Africa in History. He says the purpose of this book is to record the history of Africa as a subject in its own right that it has become, and to do this within the continental framework from earlier times. There could be different ways of composing this record since it rests upon capacious quantities of evidence from sources of mankind, from many kinds. Archaeological, written, and oral record, but the essential themes and outline the grand complex story are no longer in doubt. Much new evidence happily arrives year by year, adding to the story or revising it. But the basic outline that has emerged since the 1950s has shown itself strong enough to absorb these updating and additions. We stand on firm ground, even if much remains to be explored and explained. I want to move forward. Says that it may be asked whether one can really think that this long history as a process unfolding over 2 millennia has moved from one developmental phase to another in a manner that can be seen as so described. Many have doubted any such thing, Africans among them. Looking at the question a few decades back, an elderly historian of the West African city of Bobo, Dialuse, enlarged upon the difficulties of making sense of Africa's past. He recalled the downfall of the Western Umayyads of the Caliphate of Cordoba in Spain and opined that Africa had greatly changed since then. Considering that this event fell in the 11th century AD, it was scarcely an understatement, but the Mufti of Bobo, concerned to argue the length of intricacy of Africa's history, was aware of the fact. He proceeded to rub it in. As a further warning to anyone who should think it is easy to write African history, he observed that any attempt to bring together the events of the last 1,000 years would be like trying to trap wind in a sieve. For everybody who attained the distinction spared no effort at extinguishing the flame of his rival, and everybody was in contradiction with others, while many a year would drag on fruitlessly because of the numerous quarrels and wars among them. In saying this, of course, the learned motif was rather at the other extreme of overstatement. Yet the warning is a useful one, for it is true that scholarship is only at the beginning of a deep understanding of African past. Much remains to be discovered, much remains to be agreed. It is nonetheless already possible to know a great deal about African history. Rather, in the field of scientific archaeology, the study of languages and the movement of ideas, assembly of historical tradition, and the elucidation of records written by Africans, Europeans, Asians, and Americans. Fruitful labor and learning in several countries over the past decades have produced a large body of explanatory work and have proved that the writing of African history may be neither the repetition of romantic legend nor the mere listing of faceless names and battles along the way. These historical advances have swept away some old myths and established some new truths. The seductively agreeable belief so dear to the 19th century Europe that all in Africa was savage chaos before the coming of the Europeans may linger here and there, but not among historians concerned with Africa. The happy conviction of the European conquerors that they were bringing civilization to Africa against whom the gates of Eden had barely closed may still have its adherents, yet not among those who have looked at the evidence. Far from being a kind of museum of barbarism, whose populations have stayed outside the laws of human growth and change through some natural failing of inferiority, Africa is now seen to possess a history which demands as serious an approach as that of any other continent. What we now have, more and more clearly, is the bodying forth of a broad and vivid process of human development. Pessimist though he was, the motif of Bobo rightly conceived the problem in terms of a very long span of years, and this process of development may now in fact be seen as continuum evolving with no decisive break from the pastoral populations of the Green Sahara more than 6,000 years ago, or from the rise of the agriculture in the valley of the Nile, or even, though very mistily now, still earlier again, Stone Age peoples of the most remote antiquity. Anyone who might try to explain everything that has happened since then would undoubtedly be trapping wind in a sieve. But after all of this, it is true of the continents besides Africa, and the writing of the history would in any case become a hopeless venture if it involved explaining everything. What now exists for Europe is a fairly solid outline of the past that is filled with interesting and meaningful detail and divided for the sake of convenience into a number of fairly well accepted periods. It is this kind of outline and periodization, though as yet as far less detailed in definition, that this is now beginning to exist for very different history of Africa as well. The book that follows here is not, of course, an attempt to offer a complete review of what is known and thought about Africa's past. No such effort could succeed with a single volume unless there is a way to be a mere catalog of facts and hypotheses. And even then, the treatment would have to be unreadily dense. Besides, there is already beginning to be available a number of good histories of a single countries or regions. A list of some of them will be found further on. This means the specialists and even the non-specialists would be aware of many omissions in these pages. I'm well aware of them myself. They will be forgiven, I hope, for the sake of clarity and readability within a short volume designed to offer a continental view of the past. What follow here accordingly is an attempt to trace a broad outline of African growth and change over some 20 centuries to present a general and yet reasonable balanced summary of the years and to suggest a long-range historical explanation of Africans and their development, which modern scholarship can now increasingly reveal, and which, in the measure that is leading themes can be well and clearly shown, may really help anyone who seeks truth and loves wisdom. The winning of this new view of Africa, historical Africa, has been compared with the 19th century geographical exploration of the unknown continent. And there is something to be said for the comparison. For a long time now, laboring in solitude and often in great obscurity, many good enthusiasts have given themselves the task of African historical exploration. Like the pioneering travelers of old, they tend to vanish for months or even years, unnoticed and unsung, forgotten by all but their families and their friends, only to return suddenly one day with an effect of glamour and discovery that must be much the same as the impression made by Mungo Park nearly 200 years ago when he came from West Africa and told his London audience that he had been seeing the Niger flowing the east and not, as European geographers then believed, the west. Only recently, as I was beginning this book, a modern Mungo Park, who is otherwise a French archaeologist of many years' experience, arrived on my doorstep in the middle of the morning. He came actually from Waterloo Station in the heart of London and not from the heart of Africa. Yet he brought with him all the same the gleam and the glit in the distant places, as well as the news that beneath the ruins of certain West African site, a medieval city of Western Sudan, there lay a Neolithic settlement no smaller than 1 kilometer square. And a year later, as I was finishing the book, there came a letter from Central Africa with another piece of news still more exciting in its context. Have you heard? It laconically inquired the Hamo Sassoon in Tanzania has a date of Ngaraku of AD 1450. Thanks to many such pioneers, the truth of old Africa at last takes firm rounded shape. This unfolds the whole continent. A rigid dividing Africa into historical regions can be useful for purposes of detailed study. It will no longer satisfy a balanced view of the past. For a while, it is true that the Sahara has long placed a barrier between northern Africa and the rest of the continent, and that the great rainforests further south have sometimes proved to be still a great barrier in relation to central southern Africa. It is also true that all these regions really belong together, and that what is particular to each of them is general to them in all the foundation and emergence, so that there can be little more sense in studying Southern Africa in separation from Central and Northern Africa than in trying to understand Northern Europe apart from Central and Southern Europe. This is not, of course, to deny obvious fact that some of the Africa's large regions have developed in a distinctive from those of other regions. Yet essential truths probabilities yielded by research over the past few decades repeatedly insist two great underlying themes manifest or hidden concerning all African development, no matter what the region may be. These things are unity and continuity of cultural growth among them all, and from an immense depth of time. 1 second. Laptop was dying. Let me give you a little more. If the learned motif of Bobo had troubled with the last 1,000 years, this is nothing to the jungle of tentative terminology in which the description of Stone Age is still ensnared. Fossils and artifacts of a great variety of types have been labeled after the sites of first discovery, and the labels then attach to similar types of fossils and artifacts no matter how much distance may lie between. But the confusion has long become worse, confounded by necessary revisions and reservations to the point where any brief survey of Paleolithic, however simplified, can only be small value. A few points, even so, may be useful. Ironically enough, given Africa's more or less complete historical eclipse in recent times, Africa is now seen to have played a part of crucial importance in early human development. Thanks largely to the African evidence, several large and revolutionary revisions had to be made to the simple scheme of the 19th century anthropology. It used to be said that man and the apes had developed from a common ancestor as the Pleistocene, and that one of the tasks of physical anthropology would be to find the essential missing link between the two. It used to be thought that Homo sapiens was the first tool makers, and that it was precisely the capacity to think well enough to make tools which differentiated him from his less successful relatives. Now it seems clear, on the contrary, that Homo sapiens was in fact the tardy product of natural selection from a large number of different types of man-like ancestors, or hominids, and that some of these hominids were themselves capable of the manufacture and the use of simple stone tools and weapons. The general picture at present is one of technical development among man-like creatures that began nearly 3 million years ago, spread gradually across the world, and leads by definable stages to the disappearance of all the hominids, one after another, and the sole survivor of Homo sapiens sapiens. That is probably in context about as much as can usefully be said upon a subject of dense obscurity and diversity of opinion among the specialists, that is, the physical anthropologists who studied the origins of humanity through evidence of fossilized bones and stones tools. The specialists have worked with success in encouraging to recover the truths of human evolution, and their controversies, often richly human in the clash of personalities and ambitions, have added spice to their work. We are wonderfully better informed on all these matters than we were 30 or 40 years ago. Stay tuned. Y'all enjoy the rest of your evening. Appreciate everybody for tuning in. It gets real interesting, real quick when you walk backwards.
Cut on this.